Clickbaity titles. iRacing. 7 cars, 1 map. ACC, insensitive. RF2, absent. AMS, obsolete. Let's not go for the clickbait, right? Let's just look at some facts, non-clickbait style. Here we go. Hey everybody, this is about as big as I think my face will be tolerated, so that's about where we will do. And I need a haircut. Will happen soon. So that's very important information. Now let's get to the point. In this video we'll look at iRacing and ACC because they are the 2 sims and for which they get top marks. They give you an ability to see the aero balance with ride height changes in the car setup screen. You can mess with the ride height, you can see the aero balance. Aero balance, very important. How much of the downforce goes to the front tires, how much goes to the rear tires. The more goes to the front, the more oversteer, the more goes to the rear, the more understeer. And it's very important with the ride heights that change from the downforce itself. You know, the car gets pressed down, the ride heights change. If you have a very stiff rear suspension and a soft front suspension, and you go faster and faster, then the rear will barely move and the front will move more. So the spring stiffness and the downforce that will affect the ride heights at all sorts of speeds and all sorts of corners. Ride height is very critical for aero balance. So they give you some insight, these 2 sims, that's great. 2 things that are, I think, worth mentioning, well actually 3. First is, iRacing, we will see they use the same aero balance map for all the GT3 cars and also the 2 GTE cars that I checked. Exactly identical aero maps, which is not as bad as, you know, leave your pitchforks for now. I think there's an explanation possible for that, but it is still a little surprising. ACC has unique maps for all the cars, which is more in line with what I would expect, but it appears to be very insensitive to ride height changes. So why am I making this video? Not really to call them out, but just to look at the difference between these and also look at what I might do and what real data you might have or might not have. And also, you know, is it something to point your pitchforks at, or is it just a fact of sim development? Is that even though you have development teams with probably the same attitude, we want to make a realistic sim, they have to juggle all the balls and they have limited data. Even, you know, marketing departments never believe them. Data will always be limited to some degree. So they have to see what they have with data. They have to make the beta testers happy, juggle the numbers, fiddle with it. You get considerable differences. That's what I want to show. 2 sims that aim to be realistic, if my explanation of everything is correct, have extremely different aero balance maps. Yet they're both sims, right? So let's have a look at these aero maps, the differences, and some thoughts as we go along. Here we are in iRacing. It's amazing. It has aero balance check in the car setup. Again, big thumbs up for doing that. Here is more obvious than in ACC because it actually gives you the absolute front downforce. So in this case, with this wing and these ride heights, we have 66.95. You can play with the ride heights. Adding front ride height will probably make this number smaller. Oh, I have to press in the right window. See, play with this and you can do this for a number of points and you can create a map of some sorts. So again, thumbs up for including this iRacing. ACC also gives us some way to check the aero balance with ride height changes in the car setup screen, which is a huge thumbs up. Very nice. What happens here? You can set the ride heights here in the car setup with a wing angle and brake ducts, and you can see a thing they call the front aero variation. Now you can read the text. I interpret this as how much extra aerodynamic pressure is moving to the front or away from it, depending on how you adjust the ride height. So I think this is the front aero percentage, however not absolute. So from a base level, perhaps 40% of the downforce going to the front, and then they zero that, and then you change the ride heights and perhaps you change them and you get 1%, and that means that your aero downforce is now, instead of 40% to the front, 41 to the front. That's how I interpret it. Correct me if I'm wrong, because the results are a little strange. So playing with this here with a rear wing of 1, we are 1.1% more forward. So 41.1% if the base was 40%. More downforce going to the front. And the more wing I will add, I think the more negative that should become. So there you can see what adding wings does. So that makes sense. So again, this is not a negative 0.2 aero balance. This, if the base was 40, now we are at 39.8% of downforce going to the front. That's how I understand it. So what you can do is fix the front ride height here at 54, and then let's go, okay, 54, 1.1%, 64. See, you can make a note of these 1.7% and then add another 10 millimeters. You can make a map and then you add 10 millimeters to the front and you check the rear ride heights again. You can create a map like that. So again, super top that they do this in ACC and iRacing. So that's how I interpret this, right? Not absolute front balance, but adjustment from whatever 40%, whatever the base is. They don't want to tell you, which is fair enough, but you can still see how much more downforce goes to the front when you lower the front, for example, or increase the rear ride height. Important to see because this is a huge effect on how the car handles in the corners based on the ride heights. Top stuff, ACC, very great to see that you do this. You love to see a spreadsheet, so here, imagine what we did with ACC and iRacing. Check a whole bunch of ride heights, write down the aero balance. You can get a map. This is from a car, GT-ish car that I'm making in AMS. And you can see you can get this map. And this is the rear ride height. So we can see a rear ride height of 5 centimeters and a front ride height of 5 centimeters. Gives you this point, 34% of the downforce is going to the front axle and the, 66 to the rear axle. My brain is big. You can look this up, and what is very obvious here, you can see that increasing the rear ride height, so if you go from 4 to 5, you get 3% more front downforce. So increasing the rear ride height makes it more oversteery. Downforce moves to the front. About 3% here, 3-4% per centimeter. Centimeter is 0.4 inch, right? So 0.4 inch, 1 centimeter, 3-4% aero balance moving forward as rear ride height increases. The nose goes down. It's just the way the air flows over the car and under the car. It tends to do this. It's kind of the way it happens for GT cars, for single seaters, fairly normal. You can also see for the front ride height, if we go here from 4 front ride height to 3, we add 6% to the nose. So instead of 3% with 1 centimeter of rear ride height, with 1 centimeter drop in front ride height, we gain 6% of aero to the nose. So imagine, right, let's say you're on the straight, you got some downforce, so the car is a little low. Let's say it's at 3 centimeters, it's here. Now you hit the brakes, right? So you go from a 42% aero on the front axle, 58 on the rear. Then you hit the brakes. Let's say for a given suspension and bump rubbers and everything, your nose drops 2 centimeters. So your nose drops to 1 and the rear adds 2 centimeters, right? So you go from 1 and 5. So if this is on the straight and this is hard braking, you can see now 58% of the downforce goes to the front tire. So that might make the rear pretty loose on corner entry when braking hard as well, because the nose is lower and that changes the airflow. So you can see just how ultra important ride heights are. Not static ride heights, they don't matter, but when you're driving, when the car is pitching and rolling, that affects the downforce distribution to the front and the rear tires. Thus it affects the under and oversteer by a huge amount. Are these real values? Well, kinda possibly in the realm of reality. It's quite sensitive. So now with how that works in mind, let's have a look at iRacing and ACC, how they look. So what does it look like for iRacing? First, kind of a shock, although I will come back to this and I'm not too mad. The iRacing Aero Balance Map, according to the car setup checker, which I'm assuming is actually happening in the sim, is identical for all the GT3 and GTE cars that I tried. Identical in that for every centimeter of rear ride height change, the aero balance on these cars changes the same amount. For every centimeter of front ride height change, the aero balance on all these cars changes the same amount. Identical aero balance maps for half a dozen cars. So that's a shock. I will talk about that later. It's not so bad. What we can also see is that the map isn't really a map. There are straight lines. So it doesn't matter if we are at a high or a front low front ride height. So each line here is still a 1 centimeter difference in front ride height. And this is the rear ride height going up, 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 up. I left out the axis here because I don't think it is proprietary knowledge or anything, but there's no need for the actual numbers. You can still see it here. So these lines are very straight. The offset for each centimeter front ride height is identical and they are linear lines. All right, let's look at ACC. So in ACC we cannot do as many ride heights because we cannot go below the static ride heights, and that's weird because you are under downforce. The car will always be lower than the static ride height. So that's a niggle that I hope they fix in ACC, that you can go lower than 54 millimeters on the Lambo. But you can still create a little bit of a map, and differences here. Well, the scale is very different. We'll see that later. You can see it's this time non-linear. We can also see, although it's not visible here, in ACC every car has a different shape. So in iRacing all the cars have exactly this map. It's linear, offsets linear, and all the same for all the cars. In iRacing it's I'm getting my sims confused. In ACC it's different for each car, but also very different to iRacing. So what if we put these all together with my map? That is also not holy grail, but let's just see if we have the same axis, same scales, what does it look like? Here we have, with the same axis system, the same scales, iRacing, ACC, and what I might do. And you can see a couple of very big differences. So first, iRacing is the continuous lines here. And in my case, my Niels lines are the small dots. And these are not from the map we saw earlier. These are just some generic figures that I might use. And ACC has the striped lines. So let's look at the slope of these lines first. What does the slope mean again? As rear ride height grows, so we go to the right, the rear ride height grows. The higher we are, the more downforce goes to the front of the car. So with ride height change on the rear axle, you can see that iRacing has the steepest lines. So rear ride height fluctuations will move downforce back and forth the most. Followed by my lines, my dotted lines here, they're less steep, a lot less steep. But still the rear ride height changes will move the downforce front and back. And an ACC has by far the least influence. The lines are relatively horizontal especially compared to iRacing. So rear ride height changes in ACC, if my interpretation of that explanation is correct, barely affect the aero balance. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is the offset. So we are looking at 1 centimeter differences in front ride height. And so you see the gap. In fact, with iRacing, the gap is about a little smaller than in my case. So my car is more sensitive to front ride height changes than iRacing. iRacing is in the middle, and here again you can see that ACC, the gap between these lines is very small, so it is also relatively insensitive to front ride height changes. So what we are seeing is iRacing is sort of the average. iRacing is the most sensitive to rear ride height and in the average of these three to front ride height. ACC is by far the least sensitive to front and rear ride heights, and my car is more sensitive to front ride heights and less sensitive to rear ride heights. What is real? Well, that's an interesting topic, isn't it? So, first of all, a bit of the shock. iRacing uses exactly the same map, and I mean down to the 0.01% for all their GT3 and GTE cars. And that sounds like, hey, I'm being robbed because I'm paying $15 for it. Here's just a bit of a reality check. That's my aim with this video. Here we have, let's assume, right? iRacing, they're not idiots. ACC, they're not idiots. And me, actually, let's assume for now I'm not an idiot. We aim for simulation and we try to make it as realistic as possible. I think that's fair. You may not agree with how I make my cars, how they drive, or you might like ACC, you might like iRacing. That doesn't really matter. The aim of the development teams will be realism. Yet the differences are quite large, especially iRacing and ACC. But what is realistic? Well, the realism is no matter what the marketing department might say, a lot of the time you might not get the data. You might not get a full aero map. And in my case, I have not worked with a lot of GT teams, and one time I did, there was no aero data at all. And more recently, I got something that was able, I can sort of construct these linear simple lines that we also see in iRacing. So I don't know why they chose in iRacing to keep all these cars identical. That's something I would not personally do, but also there is probably simply no data available to them, just like there isn't, or sometimes isn't, with perhaps ACC, perhaps with RF2, perhaps with AMS. You simply cannot expect as a customer that each sim, no matter how hardcore it wants to be, has all the data. For some cars, it even doesn't exist. It means the car has to have gone to the wind tunnel, extensive testing. Now in GT, they probably do that, but in club racing or Brazilian stock cars, perhaps they don't even have that, or it's very simplified or crude. You just get a hint. And like I said, you simply don't often get the data. For Dallara single-seaters, you typically get more data. That's great. But for other single-seaters, I also only get like a couple of numbers that make me able to construct some very simple linear lines with a constant offset, like we see in iRacing and like I constructed here for my maps. So a lot of the time data simply isn't available. Can we then get mad about iRacing applying the same map to all cars? I personally wouldn't do it that way. If I didn't have data for the cars, I think I would sort of go by subjective driver feedback, or just for the sake of having each car unique, I would create differences in the aero maps of all the cars individually. There isn't really a basis other than, yeah, that's my preference. So I'm not mad at iRacing for applying exactly the same aero map to all these cars. I wouldn't do it. I think you can get the cars to feel a bit more unique, even if it's not necessarily realistic because you don't have the data. Who knows what the data is? I'd like to make them more unique. They went for let's make them all consistent and the same, probably because they don't have enough data as well. I think I cannot look into iRacing's list of data PDFs. So it's a choice, and I'm not mad at them. It's a choice they made. The cars are sort of consistent for each other. ACC, I don't quite understand. I really do hope I'm not interpreting the data in the game the way it explains the balance change. I cannot explain it any other way. Please do if you know how it works below. It is unlikely to be realistic. I don't have a lot of data myself, right? So perhaps they have more, but this is very, very insensitive to ride height changes, which is unlikely. So I'm happy to accept a different explanation for what that data means in the car setup in ACC. Let me know if you know how it works. If I am correct in interpreting it, it is probably the least realistic from a balance shift with ride height point of view. The stranger thing about iRacing is that apart from having all the maps identical on all the cars, which is dubious but a choice, I can understand that, its front and rear sensitivity is about the same. Now, I only have 1.5 GT-ish car data and a lot more single-seater data. Typically, what I see is the front ride height sensitivity is about double that of the rear. So 1 centimeter of front ride height might do 6% of balance change, then 1% of rear ride height change will move the balance about 3%. Extremely simplified rule of thumb, because this is not linear, this is unrealistic, this does not exist. However, if you don't have data, you sort of have to invent it or just stick to the linear lines that iRacing does, that I do here. There is no absolute truth because the data might not exist, and what do you do as a sim dev, right? You see the differences here. So my map, it has this weird non-linearities and things happening. Is that more realistic? Well, it has a lot more sensitivity than ACC. It has more non-linearity than iRacing. But is it more realistic? We can't really say. I will just make something unique for each car. And the way AMS works, it's actually quite hard to make those pure linear maps. And the way AMS works, you tend to get more dynamic maps like this. But is it better? you know, you might say, aha, these sensitivities are more in line with what you might expect, and they're not stupid linear like iRacing. But is it more realistic? I can't really tell. I don't have full data for this car either. So some sort of summary then, if we can. First of all, top marks again, iRacing, ACC, for providing an in-game aero balance check that you can do in the car setup. And the reason RF2 is missing here and AMS is missing here, they don't have that information as far as I know. And I'm very sure, you know, I'm kind of picking a little bit on iRacing and ACC. If RF2 would provide that information, I would happily include it here, and I'm sure you would find something different once again. Again, guys, these are sim developers, and I'm very sure they all have realism in mind, yet their implementation of what limited data they have, or perhaps adjusting it a little bit for playability, all fair things to do as game sim developers, give us a very different picture. Can we be mad at them? Well, it's the internet, of course. We should yeah, of course. We have no, cannot really be mad at them. iRacing has a lot of sensitivity, a little odd for my taste, but at least it's quite sensitive. ACC, I hope I'm interpreting it wrong. If not, then it's not very sensitive. But there is so much more going on. You got the tires, you got all the suspension stuff. So this is just one part in the big sim chain of how a sim feels, how it drives, and what perhaps the devs have to do to please most testers, and to see, you know, there might be something a little weird with the tires, and perhaps you change the aero a little bit to mask that. It's not necessarily something you can point a finger at and say it's wrong. It's just the ball juggling done by the sim devs includes aero maps and limited data. You get big differences, and that's what I wanted to stress with this video. There are big differences even though these sims try to be realistic. And yeah, it's a little curious that iRacing has all the maps identical for all the GT cars and GT3 cars, but at the same time I kind of can't blame them too much for it if you don't have enough data. So the takeaway is, no matter how you like your sim, and no matter how perhaps the marketing department say it's all real data, it's probably all the data that they get they will use. I think I would anyway. A lot of the time, a lot of data is simply missing. So your hardcore sim 1 and hardcore sim 2 will have different numbers in them, even though they aim for the realism. I think that's a worthwhile thing to repeat every now and then with sim racing. You know, it's not all perfect, and it's somewhat subjective to the devs. I think I'm repeating myself, so let's see if I can turn this into a video of some sorts, and leave your comments below and your questions below. All right, bye bye.